Let's give the internet a second to spool up. Alright, looks like we're green. Stream is good. Let's make sure the... Oh, yep, live stream is live. Fantastic. Let me get my book. Great. And the PowerPoint is visible. Also great. Kara is here. Sorry. Alright, I'll get you. Alright, everybody. Let's jump on in today. Oh, by the way, we had a really interesting question. This is one of the things I love about classes like this. We had a question from the other class, which I'm going to answer just in the PowerPoint, so you guys get the answer to the question too. It's a good question. And again, questions, if there's something you think I'm missing or you want me to explain, it's always good to ask. I'd rather have a delay with clarity than skip over something and have it be gibberish. Some of the best stuff in my slides is things where people have asked me good questions. All right. So let's jump on in. Okay, so the question, we're going to start with the question, actually, which you guys will see in a second. All right. So somebody asked a structure of Christianity question. You can actually read it in one of the text channels for the section 2, but I'll paraphrase it. So the person wanted to know, they understood the basics of what I've been explaining so far, but they wanted to understand, how do you make a religion out of this? Like, how do you get the customs, the traditions, the hierarchy, and the structure? How do you get from like a moral code and St Augustine's theory to like a structure of an institution that lasts 2,000 years? And that's a freaking great question. I've not actually answered that one before, so this is going to be my first try at it. If you think I'm missing something, feel free to ask questions about it. I'll do my best to answer. All right. And my early disclaimer, of course, some of the stuff in here people may or may not like. What I mean is, you might be a Christian and you're a denomination I talk about and you don't like my answer, you can ask me about it. I'm happy to answer. I'm trying to give just like, what's the historical answer? I'm not necessarily saying what team I'm on or who's right, but this is like, what does the history tell us? And if we're looking at it like as a structure of a real organization that exists. So, basically, it's I heard this question, synthesizing it down, is, what's the source of Christian rights, hierarchy, and practice? The contemporary, right? Like today in our century, laser pointer's better, here we go. Yeah, how did we get to this? Where did it all come from? All right, so the easiest answer, we already talked about some of this background, but the easiest answer of the structure of Christianity was the church itself is instituted by Jesus Christ, right? He is the founder of the church, right? So, and specifically it was done through his disciples. He had 12 followers, and then one betrayed him and killed himself, and they replaced him. But he had 12 original disciples, who eventually were called apostles. And from them, we get something called apostolic succession, which is a combined oral and written tradition. So we did talk about the Holy Bible, which is the core book for Christians. It's written and compiled by apostles and people in the apostolic succession. So this is step one. These guys started it. Literally by spreading, like preaching, right? They converted people, and they went around and they talked to people, and people joined their organization, and it grew. So this is the most important step. I almost skipped this one. I don't know how I got there, but this is good to know. The next one, a lot of the foundations of Christian organization are from the Hebrew/Jewish tradition. So this includes things like the calendar idea. So, for example, Passover, which is a big Hebrew holiday. Passover and Easter had the same calculation for the first 500 years. And actually, today is a perfect day to point this out. Today is literally Passover. For the next week, tonight until next Thursday is Passover. And tomorrow is Good Friday, which is Easter, which is the biggest Christian holiday that's not Christmas. It's bigger than Christmas, actually. It's because today's a religious holiday, actually, in the Christian calendar. Today's Maundy, Thursday, tomorrow's Good Friday, then it's Holy Saturday, and then Easter Sunday. And it's Passover at the same time. Nowadays, that doesn't always happen in the Latin Church. Like the Western Church, that doesn't always overlap. But the design of that comes straight from the Hebrew calendar. And again, the idea of having a lived tradition, both practically and educationally. It's the idea like if you live your tradition, you tend to learn it better. That is the Hebrew nation and the Jews themselves as a religion started it, right? So all their big historical and theological events are calendrical events. And this actually has an overlap in Asia too. most Asian societies in the traditional society have commemorative religious and historic events. In the Western sense, we've gotten rid of that in the public space a lot, but in the religious sense, it's still around. And this comes from the Jewish tradition. And also, things like chanted psalms. Psalms are basically a collection of poems from the Jewish tradition. The prayer structure, the design of churches and temples, is all the iconography and terminology is heavily influenced. Now, why? Basically, the first Christians were all Jews. That's why Jesus was a Jew. So the structure is inherently Jewish. You can't get away from that. A big part of it is. Also, 2,000 years is a long time, right? So obviously over time, there's adaptation of more practices. So like we're talking about St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, the fact they're saints, right? So there's characters from the church history who get venerated. Venerated means the church acknowledges them as being holy, but also worthy of copying, right? They're people who lived who are good examples. But also things that get much more contentious, and I'm not going to give you my opinion necessarily, but stuff like the Pope and patriarchs and bishops and church leadership. This stuff was initiated here at the beginning through the apostolic succession, but over the last 2,000 years they've grown and either caused unity or caused problems. But I'm not going to give you the opinion on it, but the leadership of the church has changed over time, and this is the number one thing people have fought over the last 2,000 years, just if you're curious. Where is the source of leadership in the church? That's the biggest fight. Now, we will actually talk about this in our philosophy, because you can't understand Western philosophy if you don't understand the Protestant Reformation, which this is incoming, that's what I mean. So they cut some or much of the calendar and additional practices from the church, depending on what kind of Protestant you are. Now, at the super basic, if you don't know anything about this, we're going to talk about it, but it was exclusive or majority focus on biblical authority with your own cultural practices. So a lot of Protestant churches also tended to be specific to ethnic or national groups. So there's Germans were Lutherans, British were Anglicans, Scandinavians became Lutherans, Scottish were a group called Presbyterians, Swiss were Calvinists. So, like, religion got reformed back towards this, what was instituted by Christ and some of the Hebrew stuff, but it also took on national characteristics. Doesn't mean it's not religious, but they tended to cut away some of this more adapted over time traditional practices. And the oral tradition. They cut a lot of the oral tradition out. So, and this has been kind of, over time, there's been parts added and taken away, and there's fights about this. But one reason I don't go into it too much is because I want to focus on the philosophy, not on the kind of the fight that's being had here. And then I wanted to make a graphic that kind of explained this in time, and I needed to pick a different color for my stupid links. I'll figure that out later. But so basically, when we're talking about like St. Augustine, right, and I got to move it down, around 0 is when you have this Christian church start, right? And this St. Augustine's in this church, and for about 1,000 years, there was just a church. There wasn't like 5,000 churches. Now, they had heretics. It might burn your brain. It's just good to know, because somebody asked how much important it is for a non-religious person, it burns my brain. It's just good to know from you're literally going to meet these people, right? They're like 60%, 70, I think the math I saw was like 75% of the United States, and even California, they're like, I think it's 65 to 67% some kind of Christian. It's good to know how this exists. And this is just a quick graphic, which you can feel free to look at later. But basically, there was one church, and then it had a couple breaks. So the first break, they had about 1,000. The Eastern and the Western church had a break. Why? The Western church says we have a pope and he's in charge, and they said, no, we have a bunch of patriarchs, and they fought about some of the doctrine, and they split. And then there's 2 additional splits. There's the Protestant Reformation, basically, and spoiler, there's more than one kind of Protestant. You have like Orthodox, traditional, apostolic Protestants, and then you have basically everybody else. And then you still have a Roman Catholic Church, still have an Eastern Orthodox Church, still have Protestant churches, and basically what they're fighting about, if you don't want to know anything else about it, you're basically fighting on a continuum here, which is orthodoxy to heterodoxy. So how much of it matches the tradition fully, and how much of it varies from the tradition. I won't give you my op-ed on it. I'll just say what we're learning in this class, we're basically only focusing on like the original tradition, like here. Does this make sense? And then, but we start to deal with some of this stuff. And why should a non-religious person care? Basically, all modern philosophy comes out of this break here. So once Protestants broke off the churches, Europeans started to look for alternate answers to philosophy. And basically all the philosophy we use in university today comes from some combination of this blow up here. So that's the relevant part. I'm not going to explain it now, but after the exam, we will talk about it. And so when that happens, we'll come back to this graphic. I just want you to know this exists, but I'm not going to explain it yet. Just see it here. That's what you need to know. But right now, we're only literally dealing with this one church. So St. Augustine is teaching in a time when everybody's unified. But in the future, it gets really complicated, and I'll explain that complexity in a couple weeks. All right, if you have questions, just type them in. And that was actually a good question. All right, and I think we stopped... I think we stopped here. Would that be accurate? People can confirm if they think I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure last class we got to here. On St. Augustine's theory of freedom and will. All right, if somebody thinks I'm wrong, yeah, we stopped here. Thank you. Appreciate it. Great. Many people agree. Okay, let's jump on from here then. All right, we got 5 people helping me. Appreciate it, everybody. Okay, so jumping on... okay, if there's this bifurcation, which is the rest of his book, basically, there's 2 kind of realms or means of existence. Basically, this means people who are in this standard of God, or as he calls it, the book name of the book, everybody, City of God. Basically, there's this idea of humility and, how would you say it? For religious people, this is like a pilgrimage of the city of God through the world. Augustine was, not that he doesn't think the world doesn't affect the church, but he kind of admitted that it's separate from reality. So if you would have asked him, how much should we care about politics? We'll get into some of the detail. But basically, his answer was, a Christian should care about politics exactly this much. As long as they have peace, and the government doesn't mess with their doctrine, just pay your taxes and keep your head down. That's basically St. Augustine's answer. There's not a necessity to, take over the whole political apparatus. And remember, this is an imperial time. There's no democracy or anything. So it's just as long as you have peace, you should be pretty happy. Now, this is interesting. Getting into, how he thinks all of this ties back into standards. He doesn't think happiness is not possible in this life because happiness requires righteousness and living life as you wish, which is not possible if not free from death. This is I'm not going to say it's depressing, but it's a very kind of astute observation. Again, there's a good underpinning question here, which somebody asked about that other slide, but I think applies here equally well. Why should I care philosophically? Why should we care about St. Augustine's observations from a non-Christian perspective? Well, philosophically and as a theory of history, these are interesting theories, right? Because if you think about this is an interesting philosophical kind of innovation. Is it possible to really be happy? Because we have to be happy, we kind of have to be righteous, live in a correct way, live as we wish. And it's hard to live as we wish if we're not free from the fear of death, right? And here's the thing. I teach this slide normally, and it's normally, you're teaching a teenager or 20-something about death. That seems far away. Even me, I'm not that much older than you guys. Death seems far away. We now live in a time when oh yeah, death's right here. And we're literally suffering the results of a lack of our freedom because of the fear of death. So Augustine has a point, right? It's hard to be fully happy if we have this lack of living as we wish and a fear of death. Again, it's an interesting just people observation. And for Augustinian, a Christian view of history, the subtitle of his chapter here is, quote, True Happiness, which is unattainable in our present life. St. Augustine just doesn't think true happiness is possible, right? So you just got to kind of do your best in this life. And he points out that this peace is what our nature craves and will never be fully and finally happy until it attains what it craves. And he doesn't say this is just a Christian thing, something in the structure of humanity. People crave this kind of universally. Again, you could argue as a external viewer point of view, this is why people kind of are drawn towards religion and philosophy, right? They want to answer, how can I be free of death, or how can death not matter, right? If you're Buddhist, death suddenly is less important because there is a way to escape, for example. All right. Now he points out too, the city of man and the city of God are both created by love. This is an interesting point he makes, and I'll get into what he means by love in a bit. But the city of man is made by self-love, and the city of God by the love of God. So he's not, how can I say it? He is distinctively telling us the differences. This is, and by the way, it's a reminder, because it's been a day. City of man and the standard of man is basically the secular city, and the standard of God and the city of God are it's both the church, like a religious community, but it's also like the transcendent community. So basically one's loving God and one's loving themselves. So it's like they have different focuses, but they both involve love. He's not saying that like the secular people don't love, they're just, what they love isn't the best thing. That would be his argument. And again, this is the pure theology. The next slide we're going to get on the practical. And it's going to go back tying to more closely to Russell, right? So what exactly, how does this kind of tie into life? How do we make a place to live out of this? All right, and here we go. Do I have it on here? Ooh, I do. Okay, and now we got another nice picture. This is another Italian Renaissance painting. Just because, it's nice to have something to look at. So, in practice, what's the difference between these two societies for Augustine? Now, let's see, 595. Okay. So, basically, he points out that in practice, the reason this matters is point of view, there's always a conflict between these two cities and each other in the city of man. Why? Well, okay, when I say city, okay, great. Somebody asks, what do you mean by city? Okay, so remember we talked about, I'll even go back. Here we go, yeah. So we talked about the city of God, right? And we talked about we started here, actually. I said, I think it was even 2 slides ago. Let me see. Boop, beep, boop. I took that slide off. It's fine. So basically, Augustine breaks reality into what he calls two, and you used air quotes, quote-unquote city. And that's a good way to think about it. Think about, there's 2 cities. And what he means is, think about it more like 2 societies in the same geographical place. So one is what he calls city of man, which is like the secular existence. And then unseparated from it, like in between it, is what he calls the city of God, which is this city that is all like for Augustine, he would say all the true religious believers, right? So there's these 2 communities that are existing in the same geographical space, but they're aiming at different things. Hopefully that makes sense. So imagine there's these 2 societies, and they're existing in the same place. So like in his time, it would have been in Rome, where you have like the secular society that manages taxes and the military and how we distribute food, and you have his city of God, which is like how religious people are living their lives, separate from people who aren't in their religion. So basically he points out that in reality, there's lots of conflict here. So there's conflict between each city. So even in any society, right, there's a conflict between like the religious community and the secular community. And there's conflict between everybody else in the city of man, right? The secular world has conflict. And again, I shouldn't even have to, this should be obvious, right? But politics exist, right? And there's wars and there's conflicts and there's riots. That just happens. And now, he also points out the city of man can also desire goods. If you remember back, we talked about how goods are kind of, for Augustine, he thinks like transcendental goods are observable even for non-religious people. And the biggest good, he points out, on a society-wide scale is peace. Peace is one of the biggest goods. And when I say peace, remember, we talked about the sack of Rome last time. So peace in this sense literally means we're not being constantly fought by barbarians who are stealing our stuff and killing our men and raping our women and selling us as slaves. So if we live in a time when we're generally at peace, that is one of the best goods now. So in this, physical reality as a secularist, peace is one of the best goods. But he does point out, peace is one of the aims of war. Like, you don't go, like, for him, and he has a bunch of just war theory. It just means when is war good. And he points out that just war is, strictly speaking, war where you're fighting to reestablish peace. That's a just war. So peace is always the aim of war. So victory for a side that's fighting for peace is just war. Does that make sense? Like, I'll give you an example of not a just war. If you were trying to fight an eternal war to sell missiles, that would not be a just war for St. Augustine. So, if you're fighting a war with a specific end to win and then end the war, for Augustine, that's a just war. And it is one of the goals of both cities, right? So the religious people and the secular people both would like peace. All right. And he mentions, too, if you've ever heard, like, very much like pilgrim imagery for the city of God, this is where he basically points out religious people necessarily shouldn't be trying to do everything of, like, the temporal world. So all the secular world stuff, it's more just like make it through it. So it's like, for Augustine's point of view, religious people are on a pilgrimage through the city of man. So, and the goal is obviously they're religious, right? They're aiming for God's city, not now. So they're shooting for eternal goods, not like money and power now. So, but this is important practically. We'll get down to it. But when you think about, Augustine's basically arguing Christians shouldn't be overly concerned with, like, running this world. All right. Now, he also goes, this is again, we're getting to his historical theory. That's why I call it practical theology. Empires are the pinnacle of the city of man. So you ask me, what is the city of man? The state and governments and the secular stuff, that's the city of man in Augustine's, how can you say, in Augustine's conception. Now, why would he say they're not perfect? Well, there are the pinnacle of the city of man. He says the issues he has with them, they presume all agency to themselves and all glory to themselves. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means, so once an empire kind of takes over, it assumes it controls everything. That's what agency to self is. So there's nothing outside of its control. And again, can we still say this is true for governments? Yes. I mean, look at how the government's reacting. Somebody says, so the city of man is a secular world. Yes. And I'm trying to use them as synonyms. But when I say city of man, here like secular world, and when I say city of God, think like specifically the Christian religious world. And that's why here it's hard to, this is one reason I did this earlier, to jump back. At this time there's only one church. So when you say the city of God, you're referring to the church. There's not like 5 churches, there's one. So, alright. And going back here. So yeah, empires are the pinnacle of the city, but the problem from an Augustinian point of view is agency is all to themselves and glory is for themselves. Now, what's wrong with this? Well, St. Augustine's a Christian, obviously, right? So glory should be to God. And agency, God has agency too. So humans are free, but the ultimate agency is God's agency for a Christian. So Augustine thinks they're just not focusing high enough. Glory is still better than money, but he said, like, if you focused on God's glory, you'd be more successful and better Christians. That's basically his argument. Now, he already talked about this a bunch, so I'm not going to waste too much time on it, but let me skip to it really quick. 780. Where am I going here? 787. I almost still had a bookmark in there. Nice. No, here we go. Okay, and this one I'm going to blow through because we kind of already did it, but he points out that Rome's foundation was an example of providence. Now, what does this mean? As we talked about before, right, providence is kind of like God's plan or God's rules for reality from a Christian point of view. So Rome's foundation was providential for Augustine, but why? Well, because it did a lot of good things, and if you don't know your history, Christianity exploded during the Roman Empire. So all of these things helped Christianity spread too. So the Roman Empire spread peace. Now, did it conquer a lot of places? Yes. But they literally made something called Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. For like 600 years, Rome was relatively peaceful, relatively stable, and life was pretty good. They spread consistent laws, and they spread unity. Remember how we said earlier, peace is one of the goods that both religious people and secular people desire. So Rome is spreading peace, therefore as long as Rome spreads peace, it's kind of getting an endorsement. The peace of Rome, it depends on how you count how long it was peaceful. They always had some wars, but from around, I'd say the peak of the peace is probably like around 0 to 400. Rome had a decent amount of peace. But, and again, you can say after that started to collapse. True, but only half the empire collapsed. But Rome's basically warrant for existing was its virtues, right? The things it practically spread. So he's basically making an argument here, like why a Christian shouldn't complain too loudly about, say, if you lived in Rome. If as long as it's spreading peace, laws, and unity, it's doing its job. Just live your religious life, right? So he's trying to get you to emphasize on the right things. Now, there's a question that gets asked a lot. How can I say it? He spends like 2 chapters of his book that I'm paraphrasing in one thing. But is there pre-Christ access to the city of God? And if you ever argued with a Christian or heard a Christian argue, people always ask that. Like, what happens to people who've never heard of him or who existed before him? Augustine's answer is, pre-Christians can access the city of God by living by God's standard. And I say, for example, Job. If you don't know who... It's not Job, it's Job. If you don't know who Job is, it's an Old Testament story of a guy who gets tested by God. But if you read it and you read the commentary on it, the guy isn't a Jew. He's just a holy man. So hypothetically, one could access the city of God by just living by God's standards, at which Christians, and St. Augustine specifically, believes are at least partially obvious from reality. All right, and anytime you have follow-up questions, let's see. I'm happy to answer them. I've got a random other answer. Okay, cool. Keep going on. Where's my time? Oh, we're doing great. Okay. City of God's ethics and society. So how do you make this an ethical system? So, okay, there's 2 cities, so what? Christians in the secular world are having their separation. The question then becomes, like, how do these people live in society with the rest of society? Because even 2,000 years ago, or 1,600 years ago, Christians weren't a majority, and even now you could argue they're a majority. They're not a majority everywhere. So how are you supposed to live in these societies? Well, basically he points out that the city of man and the city of God have different ends. What does he mean? The city of man's end is happiness. And again, he's pointing this out, right? Most secular people do, in fact, want to be happy. And he established it earlier that it's almost just like a natural law, right? People aren't existed to enjoy suffering. Like, most people want to have happiness be their end. So, for city of man, in the secular city, right, happiness is their end. And who's one's own happiness, of course? Now, it's the end of the city of heaven or the city of God. I wrote here God's bliss, but Augustine more specifically says it. To be in God's bliss, right? Like, religious people, the deal is, if God is real, and you could know he exists, right? And he actually likes you, why wouldn't you want to spend time with him? Oh, and I missed one good thing on this slide. I wanted to point out, it's a definition of love. I was looking this up because we talked about it on the previous slides. What is the definition of love in the ancient sense? Because Latin and Greek had a very different... it didn't just mean, when we say love now, we mostly mean just like emotional or like carnal satisfaction. Love in Latin had a couple meanings, and some of these words our Latin speakers will know. First one is amor, or amore, if you're speaking Italian, right? Love, affection, adoration, attachment, passion, romance. But then there's caritas, which is charity, love, affection. And then there's other ones too. So there's even in Latin, there's a kind of a bifurcation of like charity love, or love about other people and like caring about them, and then love separated as just like pure like amorous love, like for a relationship. They also had words like agape in Greek, which is like gift love or unconditional love, or delexito, which is love / goodwill / pleasure / delight. So this idea that in English we kind of have one word for love, which it's good to remember that it's not the only definition in a classical sense. So when you say like the end, like both cities have certain ends, it's good to remember that they have kind of different definitions too. All right, so there's also focusing on the one appointed ends of the cities is what's the supreme good? You know, is it an internal good? Is it an external good? Is it a monetary or power good? Or is it like God's good? So that's another one to keep in mind. Oh man, this one's fun. I'm going to get my dictionary. Hold on. Here we go. Okay. Let's, come on, move. Here we go. All right. So this one I'm just quoting from the book, and you might not have no idea what these words mean, so I'm going to show you. So he points out, even though both these cities exist, it doesn't mean, for example, just because somebody is in, for example, a religious community, it doesn't mean they're repro. Did I spell it right? I spell it right. Yeah. Okay. So in this I say here, and this is just straight from Augustine, there's a mix of elect and reprobate even in the church. And I remind you, the church is a synonym for the city of God, which is not the city of man. Now what he means here is, let me show you these words. Elect means, here we go, in theology to designate, to choose, or select as an object or mercy or favor. And here we go, right? Someone who's chosen. And chosen by who? God. And the idea here is they have grace. And the other word, reprobate, this means abandoned to sin, lost to virtue or grace. What's the modern way to say this? Basically, just because somebody's in a church doesn't mean they're like a saved Christian. They might just be hanging out, or they like the free food. So he points this out because he makes a great point that you can't really know who is where, right? So you don't know like who in the church isn't a good Christian, and you can't know who in the world isn't living by God's standards just because they're not going to a church. So he's like, it's not our job to differentiate these two things. It's good to know they exist, but you can't really know who's going where, right? You can't read intent of people. And I think, oh, somebody's late. If you're late, just tell me after class. I'll get you. Just hang out for a couple minutes after. All right. Now, the virtues, he mentions these a bunch, but I'm going to leave them alone until we get to St. Thomas, because St. Thomas Aquinas explains them better. But the virtues that, from this time period till basically now, that are the temporal virtues for basically for the church, is temperance, prudence, justice, and wisdom. Now, if these sound... Oh, actually, I missed one. Wait a minute. No, I think I got them. It's fine. So we'll get in the four virtues later. It's just good to know they exist. And in Augustine's time, he's the first one to really codify them, but they're basically adaptations of the Greek virtues. We'll get there later, though. Now, he points the problem of, again, going to why we should care about this difference. There's some problems in the city of man, especially when it comes to incomplete justice. Now, what he means here is there's incomplete justice in both law and the war. Now, he gives examples, actually. Let me see this. 862. No, that's not it. I'm, doopy boom. 860. 860. All right. Oh yeah, this one's depressing. So he talks a little bit about mistakes of human justice when the truth is hidden. And he actually, if you did know anything about the Roman Empire, would you be shocked to know they sometimes use torture in questioning criminals? And he points out, and one reason we don't use torture that much anymore, just because you torture somebody doesn't mean they'll tell you the truth. And nowadays, and even 2,000 years ago in Rome or 1,600 years ago, justice in the city of man is basically incomplete. Same thing in law, same thing in war, right? Every war isn't just, every law isn't just. So the biggest critique against kind of the city of man as an idea is it is incomplete. They attempt justice but can't quite hit it. Or they try to do just war but make many mistakes. And somebody asked the question, talking about justice, did Lao Tzu believe the way of the nature is justice? It's a good question. Yeah, I would say, well, Lao Tzu doesn't care about justice. Or more correctly, if you pushed him, Lao Tzu would probably just say justice is doing what is natural. That'd be the Taoist answer. That doesn't mean, but justice is a little bit too specific, I think, for a Taoist to worry about. They would probably say it's just a construction to constrain nature, which is wonderful or depressing, depends on your perspective. But again, this is an obvious one we can know too. Y'all, we live in the United States. Is every war the United States has done in your life been a just war? That's a good question. And is our justice system complete? Again, you don't have to be a Christian to ask the questions. Again, this is why we're talking about kind of St. Augustine as like a philosopher too, because he's just making philosophical points, both at the incomplete justice now, and then there's some kind of desire for more justice. All right. Now, he basically talks about then where is complete justice or complete peace? Well, he's to give kind of Christians advice on where to live. He says there's only complete peace in God, and as we talked about before, peace is basically the ultimate end, and this is very interesting. And then if a Christian asks him, like, where should I start looking for peace and justice? He says it should start at home. He does not say Christians should start, like, on the street or voting. He's like, make your home peaceful first. And to remind you, way back, I'll answer that question at the end of the slide. It's a funny question, though. But okay. So there's complete peace at God, and it starts at home. So in this one, basically it would say, don't even start to worry about the city of man until your own house is peaceful. And if you remember back when we started doing the Greeks, and the Romans had a very similar state, home is kind of a euphemism for your clan / your family unit / your business. So St. Augustine thought, like, how does a Christian live peacefully in the world? You got to start having a peaceful home. So, like, don't have lots of conflict, love each other, take care of each other, don't exploit each other in the home space. And from there, you could somehow start dealing with the world. But you have to start small. Okay. Now, by the way, I'm going to point out, in 1600 years ago, being, like, anti-torture is kind of a big deal. And another one, too, right? Talking about man's natural freedom. This one. I'll read it and then explain why this one's kind of huge, too. He mentions that man has natural freedom. And if you remember from last time, when St. Augustine means natural, he means literally, and this is, by the way, when we talk about Locke and Hobbes, we talk about natural rights, they're using the same definition of natural that St. Augustine uses. And this is why studying this back matters. He says man was naturally created free. Why? Man was created by God perfectly, which include perfectly free. Every man. Not just like Christian men. All men were created free, according to St. Augustine. If that sounds familiar, like it's perhaps in a document that our country has in its founding documents, this shows you kind of the political implementation of Augustine, even 1,500 years later. So he believes that men all had natural freedom, because freedom is good, and God wouldn't create people not free. However, slavery exists because of sin. Like, men fall from goodness, and sin is added to reality. And he points out, too, and when he says because of sin, it's not just because of, like, sin in general, but he says, like, sin, like, when people sin, like, they become slaves to things as well. And then he points out subjugation is not natural and is an evil. Wow. So this is both a critique of subjugation in general, but subjugation of people in specific. Do I have it here? I don't have it here. Because there's a point I wanted to make here, too. Subjugation is not natural evil, and I think I forgot my point. Let me think about it. Slavery because of sin, subjugation is not natural and evil. Read my sidebar. No, we're good. Somebody asked, does home also refer to the heart here? Well, I mean, kind of, because if you say complete peace starts with God, that would mean you have to start with God and yourself, right? So if you're not at peace, then you can't, how could you make a peaceful home if you're not peaceful? Does that make sense? So if you are peaceful, then you can make a peaceful home. And if you had enough peaceful homes, perhaps you could make a peaceful society. That's kind of the St. Augustinian logic. It's a ground-up peace, actually. And someone said, would being materialistic consider a sin? Sure, but it depends what you mean by materialistic. If you mean materialistic in like the popular sense, how can I say it? Like we overemphasize owning stuff. Even nowadays, most of the church would consider that yes. And why would Augustine say that's probably a sin? Because you're basically just you're focusing on physical goods, not non-physical goods. But if you mean materialism, like you're literally a Marxist and you think there is no spiritual realm, well, sure, that'd be a sin because you just don't think spiritual things exist. But if you're a materialist, you don't care about that anyway. But yeah, being overly worried about stuff in that meaning of materialism, yeah, he'd be against it. We have a random question. I don't know any better time to answer it. Say, what would Lao Tzu think about hippies? That's out of left field, but I get the impression that Lao Tzu wouldn't mind hippies too much. I think he'd kind of, compared to most Western mindsets, he'd probably be a fan. All right, so, and the point I just want to make here, too, the idea that there is natural freedom in men, and that slavery is an evil. Remember, Rome was a slave empire, and this is well over 1,000 years before slavery was illegal anywhere. So there's you see these kind of cores of modern ideas in St. Augustine. And this is where some of the specifics might not seem very relevant to you if, say, you're a secularist or you're not a religious person. But stuff like this is where you can start to see, like, oh, all of those religious ideas lead to ideas like men have natural freedom. And again, reminder, whenever I say men, I mean humans. Now, why do we care about that peace again and worrying about, like, men's natural slavery? Well, the goal of the heavenly city is to be peaceful citizens in the city of man. So if you ask, like, for a Christian, why does this matter? Or for a non-Christian? Well, the goal for St. Augustine is for these people to be peaceful citizens. And he even says, be flexible in terms of what the government asks, but there's one caveat. Not at the expense of doctrine. So if the government tries to get you to rewrite your religion, then you resist. But up until then, Christians should just be peaceful in the secular city. Just pay your taxes, get along, follow the laws, be good citizens. So this is a very interesting exhortation. Again, this is basically political advice. And somebody has another good question. Here we go. Would Roman slave owners just overlook this belief of man's natural freedom? No. For Christians, it's explicit, actually. It's in the New Testament. And it basically says, like, slave masters, treat your slaves like your sons. If you're a Christian and your slave, regardless if your slave's a Christian or not, right? So treat your slave like your son, and then if your slave's a Christian, treat him like a brother. Now you say, Professor, what about freeing your slaves? It's harder than that. Like, slavery in this time period was a contractual thing. The best example I could give you is think about, like, the legal difference between someone who came to the United States illegally and a citizen. And, like, think about, actually, there's a 3-tier system. Imagine, like, someone who came to the United States illegally, a legal immigrant, and a citizen, and how they each have different access to different rights. Although that's breaking down a little bit. That's kind of the differentiation Rome had. So you might have someone working in your home, and when like, you're a slave, like, people take care of you all the way, right? You have to live there, they feed you, but you just don't get to control your labor. But the Christian exhortation was, at least treat your slaves as well as you treat your children. So they didn't overlook it. Christians were kind of like, not realists, but Augustine's pointing out, you need to start with you can't start with society, right? So if everybody basically treats slaves with humanity, eventually slavery will disappear. If you ask St. Augustine, would that take 1,000 years? He may have been a little shocked. But the principle's the same in 1860 and 400, basically. And of course, there's bad Christians, or there's Christians who pretend to be Christians, or there's lots of people who aren't Christian, or, there was a certain point when the government just forced everybody to be Christian. What do you think the chance is, like, a good percentage of those people just said it, so they didn't get an extra tax or something? So something to keep in mind. Alright, now, this is interesting too. So when I said support and be peaceful, from the very early church, one of the most important things that includes support is prayer for the leaders. Remember we talked about empires, or the top of the city of man? So even if the empire is not a perfect empire, Christians are supposed to always pray for their leaders. I know this isn't popular. I mean, regardless of your political affiliation, you at least sometimes don't like your leader. St. Augustine says, doesn't matter. You should still ask for him to be helped by God. That's your job as a Christian. So, I don't know what image people have in their minds of, like, what does it mean to be a Christian in politics, but this is Augustine's answer of, like, how we should live together. And finally, he basically says, it's not your job to worry about it. And why not? Well, I'm basically going to paraphrase the last, gosh, how much of this? The last 200 pages of his book are all about the Last Judgment. But he basically says, don't worry about it. God will sort it out later. It's not your job. Just you live a peaceful life. Let God sort it out. Now, if you're a non-religious person, there is still something there, right? Because think about it. The point is, it's almost like a libertarian point of, like, leave people alone. As long as you have peace, you and your community live a peaceful life. You can't control everybody. God will figure it out. And again, it makes sense. Even if you're not a religious person, if a religious person believes God is strong and just and all-knowing, it is his job to figure it out, not yours. Man. Let me see. Do I skip that one? I'm giving myself. So to TLDR, you're chilling, let God handle it. Yes. And again, right, it's consistent logically if one believes in an all-powerful God. It's not up to you to, like, judge everybody else, right? And by judge, we mean, like, sit in a judgment seat on them. Someone asks, is that why we have the last rites law for both Catholics and Christians? The last rites are, you're just kind of, confirming where you're going. That would be what I would say, especially for more Catholic or traditional-minded people. Confessions are really important. And a lot of Protestants, too, actually. Kind of like, going into death with a clear conscience. That's kind of the idea. Because if you know you're going to be judged at the end, you'd really want to go into that with, because you're a Christian, you believe it, you should go into it with as clear conscience as you can. What about worrying about external chaos that affects you? That's a great question. And again, Augustine would say, peace is still the end goal, right? So you should care about external... As long as you have peace, you can kind of leave the secular world alone. But if there's actual chaos that affects you, then you have an interest in restoring peace. That's basically, again, his justification for action is restoring peace. So this is a Christian justification for war, too. Traditional Christians are not pacifists, strictly speaking. Because restoring peace is always a justification for going to war. And remember, I say restore peace, I mean restore peace in your geographic location. Going halfway across the world and invading a random country is not necessarily restoring peace. So restoring your internal peace of your nation is something Christians should be involved in, according to St. Augustine. And if somebody asks, what are the last rites? It depends on the denomination. What they will entail, but they tend to entail. I have a couple reference books here. I'm looking for an example. So the last rites are some version of. Let's see. I have a couple books here. I'm looking at it too. It's basically you're doing ministry to the dying. That will involve things like. You basically ask for mercy, and you pray some, and you do a confession, and you basically ask for blessing, that kind of thing. So, also, not worry is also considered a sin. Are you saying, is worry considered a sin? Kinda, yeah. In the way, but like, how can I say, if the commandment for a Christian is like trust God, then not trusting God, worrying means you're not trusting God enough, right? So, shouldn't you trust Him more? That's, but it's natural to worry, right? But like a religious person, if you think, I would say this is true for even like a Muslim or a Buddhist. Like if you're a Buddhist and you think Buddha's real, Shouldn't you just trust that he'll end your suffering and lead you to nirvana eventually if you believe? Or if you're Muslim, don't you think God will take care of you in the end? Or if you're a Christian, shouldn't he do his job? Just like if you're an atheist, I mean, worry all you want, because this is it, right? If the material reality, if atheists are right, and this is it, then definitely you should be worried. But if it's not, then you should believe what you believe. That would be what St. Augustine would probably say. And I would say just be consistent. And that's one of the fun parts of this class, trying to be consistent. All right, folks, we only have 15 minutes. We're a little bit behind, so I'm going to skip one of my slides. Any other questions about City of God before we go to time theory? I don't see any pings. And to talk about the time theory, I'm going to skip to this while we wait for questions. To quote Russell, this is the part, if you read Russell's chapter on St. Augustine, this is the part that makes Bertrand Russell, the atheist, happy and sad. Why? He basically says St. Augustine's time theory is his most pure philosophy, and it basically shows his brilliance, not just as like a writer or like a bishop or something, but like as a thinker, right? He is a very dynamic philosopher in his own right, and Bertrand Russell's just sad he didn't spend it all trying to like fix Rome, which is quite interesting. All right, this was also the reading if you read Confessions 11. If you haven't read it yet, I don't think we're going to finish today. 15 minutes doesn't feel like enough, so I'll probably do about half today, half next class. So if you haven't read it, I recommend reading it between now and next class. All right. So what's St. Augustine's time theory? And it's, by the way, this is tied to his creation theory, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Okay, so on a practical level, St. Augustine's trying to rectify Plato with Genesis. If you don't know what Genesis is, it's the first book of the Bible, and it's the creation story for Christians and Jews. So there's a couple answers of how in the world has people considered creation to work. Well, there's the Orthodox answer, which there's creation from nothing. What are the other answers? Well, the Greeks thought, and a lot of the ancients actually believed, that there was never any there was either creation of like a creator, but he didn't actually make physical reality, he just arranged physical reality. And then there's the other ancient view, that was the Platonic Aristotelian view, but then there was the other view that just reality is eternal, and it's always there is no creation or end. That's actually the simplest theory. I had somebody say either Big Bang or creation. I'm like, no, there's an easier theory, just reality's always been there, and it will always be there. So, but the creation from nothing is the Orthodox position. So he's trying to explain how does Plato match this. Now, interestingly enough, kind of in how you explain any divine absolute, there's basically three big theories. First, there's did I do these right? Hold on. Yeah, there's like pantheism, which is God is everything. Russell actually mentions pantheism of Spinoza. So this is kind of, actually it should be pantheism, but anyway. Wait, do I have it? Oh yeah, okay. I think I need to add an E, but fine, we'll just do pantheism for now. So God is everything. This is, Russell mentions Spinoza. Spinoza is his favorite philosopher, by the way, and Spinoza thinks that just kind of everything is God and God is everything. The best comparison to this, what we've studied so far, Buddhology has a very similar, Buddhology's in this pantheism camp, where everything has a Buddha-ness. So basically everything's Buddha. Does that make sense? So everything's God. So this is one theory. A second one is called deism. This is, and wouldn't pantheism be Shintoism? Yes, where the word I'm actually looking for, let me see if I can find it. I think I did it wrong on the slide. Ooh, hello. Okay, it's such a rare word I'm looking for, I'm not even going to worry about it. I found it in a book, but I'm not going to worry yet. So pantheism just means there's lots of gods, which is Shinto. The word I actually wanted here was pantheism. There's an extra E between the pan and the theism. Pantheism is everything is God. It's a very obscure word, so we'll just leave pantheism for now. But so Shinto just think there's lots of gods. Pantheists thinks everything is God. So Buddhists just think everything is God. Shintoists think specifically there's lots of gods. So it's a slight difference, but it matters. Deism is the theory that there's a God, but he's far away and unconcerned. This one's been called like the clockmaker theory. Like imagine like the reality is a clock and God made it and walked away. So for a pantheist, would every single atom be God? Yes, that's basically what they're arguing. So God is everything and everything is God. That is a pantheist. And Spinoza is that, and Russell likes it. And it actually matches kind of Buddhist Buddhology too. And the third way, this is kind of the Christian method, is God is intently involved and connected, but distinct from reality. Again, for a Christian, Obluto, no, but for a pantheist, yes. So the Christian Orthodox answer is God is intently involved and connected and distinct from creation and made everything. So St. Augustine's, the reason I point this out, St. Augustine's theories are built on the third type. And it's just, not all of it's going to be on the test, but it's good to know which theory of kind of God's existence is St. Augustine using for his philosophy. But technically, yeah, God would be everything for a pantheist, or a Spinozan, which is Russell, basically. Which is weird, Russell's like an atheist, but he's more like a universalist than an atheist, right? He thinks everything's God and God is everything, and on a simple level. All right, so let's get into time theory a little bit. And you should have read this. If you didn't read it yet, we're going to get maybe 2 slides in, and then we'll finish it next class before we start St. Thomas. So I'd say definitely be sure to read it. The first time you read it, it might be kind of gibberishy, so having it explained helps. And let me get out my book. Here we go. All right. So fundamental. He gets into time theory because people ask the question, like, what did God do before creation? Like, before the reality existed, was God just bored or something? This is actually a really good question. Let me find this. It's kind of, I'm trying to see. Yeah, this is, if you have your copy, it's the subsection 10. And he says, those who ask, what was God doing before he made heaven and earth, are still seeped in error and they should have discarded. Like, and then they ask, like, was he at rest? Was he doing nothing? Why did he not continue doing nothing forevermore, just as he has always done in the past? So people, lull at paragraph 12. I'm not sure which one. What page number is paragraph 12? Oh, my answer to those who ask, what was God doing before he made heaven and earth? He was not preparing hell for people who pry into mysteries. And he says, this is a frivolous retort, has been made before now, so we are told in order to evade the point of the question. Which, I mean, it is invading, but that is a funny answer. I'm going to use that for my kid. When my kid asks a question I don't know the answer to, he's preparing hell for people who pry into mysteries. I'll say that to my kid. No, I would never do that. Okay, so basically, God's creation of reality requires him to precede it. If Christians are right, and Jews are right, and God created reality, he has to precede reality. Because you can't, it'd be like being a programmer. How can you say it? Like, a program can't be the programmer. Does that make sense? Like, a video game character can't construct the video game he's in. Just like reality, God couldn't be in reality and create reality. One of those has to be true. So logically speaking, for St. Augustine, God had to precede reality. And then God also is existence. We'll get into this more when we get to St. Thomas. But God is beautiful and good, for which reality gets both traits from. He just is. He is, period. So all is from God, too. All of existence, the verb is, all things existing come from God directly. And all beautiful and good things, too. And then he goes really deep into this, but I'm just going to hit it nice and light. The method for creation, he asks 2 or 3 pages of this question, is the Word, which is co-eternal with himself, and I don't know if we have any Christians here, but the Word is another way to say Jesus. So Jesus is co-eternal with God, and was the method for creation of reality. All right. So this leads to the question, what was God doing before he created the heavens and the earth? What's the answer? Well, so Augustine's kind of like praying / talking to God, so his format might sound a little weird, but let's get into it. He says, "You are the maker of all time. If then there was any time before you were created heaven and earth, how could anyone say you were idle? You must have made time, for time could not elapse before you had made it." Let that sink in a second. And then also he says, "But if there was no time before heaven and earth were created, how can anyone ask what you were doing then? If there was no time, then there was no then." So basically, in eternity, supreme over time, God's in some kind of never-ending present. If Christians are right about God, this is Augustine's basically argument, St. Augustine. So if God made physical reality, God had to make time too. So if he made time and physical reality, there was no then before the creation of time and the creation of stuff. So the question doesn't even work. You can't actually ask what was God doing before, because there was no before time existed. If this sounds elaborate, welcome. And then, this is, again, quoting him. I should have put quotes on it, but he says, quote, "You are at once before all past time and after all future time." And actually, for next class, I think I might make a graphic. Let me make a note. Normally, I draw this on the whiteboard, but I don't have whiteboard, so I'll have to 190 graphic of time. Okay, I'll make a graphic for this next time. But so St. Augustine basically concludes that God has to be before all past time and after all future time simultaneously. If that doesn't make sense, let it sink and then think about it. I'll explain it. We'll go over it again next class. So humans in time. How does this affect us? Well, first, he points this out, which is trippy if you think about it. But for St. Augustine, only the present truly exists. And this starts from 266, I think. Let me see. Yeah. 266, he starts getting into... so what time actually exists? Well, he points out we can only prove the present exists. Like, right now only exists. So the past is memory now, right? We think of the past in our memories, and it exists in our minds, but it's the past. Same thing with the future, right? The future is our expectation in our minds now of something to come. It is not yet here. Okay, can I go back? Is it a question, or do you just want to see it for notes? The last slide. People like I'm still writing, or my internet lagged out. Okay, I'll leave it up for a sec. Remember, this is a video that you can access later, so I'll leave it up for a second just in case there was a lag. But you can just like reload this video forever, and then you'll get my notes. And also on YouTube, I am going to upload the unlagged version that I record locally on my computer. So if there ever is any audio issues, the YouTube version should always be audio issue free. If there's lag or I drop out or something. So yeah, you can come back after and just pause it here. Just take the time code and it'll be there. Are the two bottom quotes? This one is a paraphrase, and this one is a quote. So the second to last on the bottom is me paraphrasing what he says, and this one is actually his quote. I just keep forgetting to put the quote-unquote. Somebody asks, what does truly exist mean? Well, talking about time, Monica? So truly exist, yes, okay. So this is interesting. So it truly exists, another way to say that is like empirically prove it exists, right? So only the present truly exists means we really only can prove objectively now exists. Does that make sense? Like, in 1 hour does not exist. Think about it. We expect the next hour to be here, but it is not yet here. It does not truly exist. And you in 5th grade existed, but it does not currently exist. It does not truly exist now. Only the memory of you in 5th grade exists. That's what it means by truly exist. Right? Really only in this moment we're in, this exact individual moment where you're like, my goodness, professor's still talking about time. Only this long, boring moment exists. Every other moment doesn't empirically exist. Oh yeah, if you didn't read this yet, this is super trip. We'll go over it more next time. It's great. And then he points out, basically what we have is the present. Well, let me explain it, and we can argue if it's real or fantasy, but this is how he explains it. So the present is the present of present things, okay? And then the memory is the present of past things, and expectation, the future, is the present of future things. So he's not saying the past and the future don't exist, but he's saying they, from a human point of view, right? Because this is human time. In a human point of view, the past and the future only exist through us now in time. They don't exist independently of us in time. Just chew on that for a second. And this is interesting too. He spends like 2 pages on this one. I love it so much. The units of measurement of time exist, but they're not internal to our minds. They're external to our minds, right? So a second doesn't actually exist inside of our mind. It only exists outside of our mind. And can I prove this? Sure. Oh, but let me say this last point, and then I'll give you some examples. Time really only truly is measured in our minds. It's not really measured outside of our minds. So he gives examples of poetry and meters and language, right? So we can kind of make examples in our minds of time, but it's still subjective. This is his idea. So, and again, there's easy examples here to prove he's right empirically. Think about when you're doing something that's really fun and you're having a great time. Does time move faster or slower? Almost always it moves super fast. Subjectively, right? In your mind. My best example, if you've never played a massively multiplayer online game, that is my favorite example of time flying by. 12 hours at night on World of Warcraft or something, or I don't know, everybody plays Fortnite now, right? Like, those kind of, like, time warps, right? But here's the thing. Subjectively, that time moved faster. And right now, 12 hours of Animal Crossing, exactly. But flip it around, right? I'm a teacher. I like my class. But empirically, right? Empirically, my class is longer in your mind than playing a video game, right? Because why? I'm shooting a lot of new detail at you. It doesn't matter if you love it or dislike it. Just the pure amount of detail will make that time longer. And depending on how boring you find me online, it could be really long, right? So time itself in our minds is actually subjective. And we know this both from experience, but then once he explains it, it's hard to argue with it. And this is kind of Augustine's most interesting pure philosophy. It's just like, wow, man, this guy's got a point. Well, thank you. Somebody said, no, actually, your class is one of my faster classes. I appreciate it. But still, right? Isn't that funny? Like, all classes could be an hour and 15 minutes, but subjectively, they have different amounts of time. It's exactly. Somebody says, like, getting lost while practicing a song. Exactly. Right? Like, 10 hours of musical practice could feel like an hour. Yes, somebody made a great point. No, professors, your lectures are so fun. By the way, it's the end time. I agree. So, folks, if you didn't read... Somebody has a fun math class. That's good. If you didn't read this yet, we're going to start again on this slide next week. So if you still have time theory questions, this will be the time to answer it. I'll do a quick review, maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and answer questions next class. But for now, we're done. We're going to come back next week. answer some more questions about St. Augustine's time theory, and then we're going to start St. Thomas Aquinas. The Russell reading first, and then the E-Reserve reading. So if you have any problems or questions, type them in the Discord or send me a private message. For everybody else who's a community member watching, thank you for being here. I'll see you all next class or next Tuesday. Have a beautiful week.